You say you believe in God. You have been...
No, I say I act as if he exists.
You say what?
I say I act as if he exists,
Okay,
which is a much more precise claim.
Okay, so then what, but in this case, what... So you act as though God exists.
Yep.
And in addition, I've heard you say that I act as though God exists, that I can't really be an atheist.
So far it seems
yeah,
that.
Right, yeah.
We'll see.
The night is young.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I'm not really an atheist. I've heard you say this. So that
well, some of you is.
Well, if I were really an atheist, I would be far more poorly behaved than in fact I am. Right? I would be like Raskolnikov committing murders and assuming there was nothing wrong with it.
It would be more likely, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
wait, that's a big distinction.
I need to know.
Be more likely.
What was that?
It's a big distinction. That you would is very different than it would be more likely. Taking the safety off the gun is not the same thing as shooting it, right?
Yeah.
The temptations laid open to Raskolnikov would be more at hand.
Okay.
Just as they were to him.
So, what in that? So, in what sense do you mean? What is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists? And what is the God-shaped thing I must have in my life to prevent me from being a, quote, real atheist?
Well, okay, first of all, I have to point out that there's no possible way I can answer both those questions in 2 minutes.
Well, it's the same question. I mean,
yeah,
what do you mean by God?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you some of the things that I mean by God. Okay?
We do have to get to questions.
Maybe we're going to do this tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe this is where we start. Oh, God. Well, that was a pretty resounding no.
It seems like that constitutes an audience question, wouldn't you say?
All right, I tell you what. Let's... Let's do this, but let's be deliberate about time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to read some things that I wrote because it's so complicated that I'm not sure that I can just spin it off the top of my head, and so you'll have to excuse me. So, and what I'm going to do is sort of paint a picture by highlighting different things. So now I already made one point here. I made the point that part of the conception of God that underlies the Western ethos is the notion that whatever God is expressed in the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. And that isn't all it does. It also confronts the chaos of being itself and generates habitable order. That's the metaphysical proposition. And that's best conceptualized as at least one element of God. And so I would think about it as a transcendent reality that's only observable across the longest of time frames, the longest of iterated time frames, to your point. So here's some propositions, and they're complicated, and they need to be unpacked. So I'm just going to read them, and that'll have to do for the time being. So God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old. So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, men arrange themselves into hierarchies, and then men rise in the hierarchy, and there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise, and those principles aren't tyrannical power. They're something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak, and that will radically increase your reproductive fitness. And the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like the notion of God the Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women, because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy, and the question is what should be at the top of the hierarchy, and the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
Jordan, if I can I just cut in here with one question?
I'll stop with that for now.
What? So I was not hearing in that list of attributes a God who could care if anyone masturbated. I was not hearing a God who...
Depends on what else is stopping you from doing, Sam.
Sorry, I missed that.
I said it depends on what else it's stopping you from doing.
Well, yeah, okay, so it's
yeah,
important to live. It's important to do something other than masturbate.
Yes. Yes, which actually constitutes a problem for many people.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them, right? And so I'm wondering what percentage of religious people who would say, "Oh yeah, I believe in God and it's the most important thing in my life." What percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen. So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It may be that they have the intuitions, but they haven't been articulated well.
I mean, this is the problem. This is what worries me about this. So, I mean, you could do the same thing with the idea of ghosts, right? So people traditionally have believed in ghosts. It's an archetype, you might say, the ghost. Survival of death is certainly an archetype. And we know what most people most of the time mean when they say they believe in ghosts. And I say, I don't believe in ghosts. And you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You know, you win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost. Most people
but you
mean...
can't use that simplified argument about my conception of ghosts as an analogy for the propositions that I just put forward.
This is what I see you do. I mean, maybe you have more to say on the topic of God, but this is what I hear you doing with God. You have defined the God that most people believe in, and we know this is the God that most people believe in.
I was asked what God I believed in.
I'm asking you what percentage. Yes, but you by shifting the definition, you have robbed the noun, the traditional noun, of its traditional meaning, and you're imparting to people.
Wait a second. People.
I'm not so sure.
What do you mean by
this.
traditional meaning? Look, it's one of the elemental claims in the Old Testament is that you're not even supposed to utter the name of God, because by defining it too tightly, you lose its essence. And so let's not be talking about what the classical definition of God is here, okay? It's a historical non-starter. Okay, and there's plenty of religions that make it...
Can I check in with the audience? Is the audience all right with us continuing down this road?
No. Okay.
So, can I jump in here?
You're sacrificing your Q&A.
So, yeah, that it is at the expense of Q&A. That's what you're giving up. But I think it's probably worth it. So, let me say, Sam, I do not believe in a supernatural God. But the God that I heard Jordan just describe, I do not have any difficulty understanding why he might care if you masturbate, and I also don't have any trouble figuring out how he might answer prayers.
Well, tell me more then.
Well, I can tell you how a prayer might be answered.
Okay, but these are
Well, it's specific, so you could let me do that.
So it'll be interesting. So I'm not Jordan. We've not talked about this. If I heard an answer from him that actually would satisfy me as to what the mechanism of action might be, that'd be pretty interesting. And if he can tell me what I heard, I think it would suggest that we're not just making up stories here.
Okay, and you might like this, you maybe not, but it's possible. Okay, so imagine that. Okay, so let's imagine that hellish situation that you laid out. Okay, but let's put the extra twist in it, because one of the things that we both decided, I think, was that you also have to build in the intent into that. So let's say the hell that we're talking about isn't the victim of the terrible massacres that you laid out in the jungle story, but a perpetrator. Okay, so someone who's actually acted in a malevolent manner, truly malevolent manner. Okay, or maybe perhaps we wouldn't have to take that extreme case. We could say, well, perhaps you've decided that, you've decided that you've seriously done something wrong. Okay, and that you want to get away from hell, you want to make things better. Okay, so here's an exercise you can try. So what you do is you sit on the edge of your bed and you say, okay, what I did was wrong. And you have to really believe this, right? So you've thought about it, it's killing you. It's killing you. So now you're penitent and you're confessing, let's say. And you're confessing to yourself as much as to anyone. And you say, I really want to know what I did wrong. And I really want to know what I could do to put it right. And I'm willing to accept any answer that will manifest itself to me. You try that. See what happens.
Well,
that's a prayer that will be answered, and it won't be answered in the way that you want it to be answered. I can bloody well tell you that.
Okay, but that...
Well, what are you communicating with when you do that?
No. That is something that is a process that I'm familiar with. It doesn't require any supernatural explanation, and it certainly doesn't require that we imagine that any of our books were dictated by the creator of the universe.
I didn't say that it required any supernatural explanation or that it required the book. I was asked to provide an instance of prayer that worked, and that's what I did. I didn't do anything other than that.
That's fully understandable in terms of human psychology. And
it's not understandable because we don't know where the answer comes from.
Well, we don't know where anything comes from.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, but that doesn't open the door. I mean, one thing we can know with absolute certainty is that whoever wrote the Bible didn't know either, and there's many other things he or she didn't know, like everything else we know scientifically, right?
It's not so obvious what people know and what they don't know.
No one even knew the brain was involved in any of this. Right. So
yeah, but they probably knew about as much as we do about how the brain was involved in it.
But we've already established in some tenuous way that things that nobody understands could have evolved into these stories in some way that would be useful, but nobody knew what they were writing when they wrote it. Right.
The problem is that you can. So again, this has been focused through the lens of your attachment to Christianity largely, but Hinduism is a completely different set of stories, right? And many of them, the logic, the emotional logic, the psychological import, many of them have the opposite valence from any Christian story you would tell. The whole notion of, like, for instance, the whole notion of good and evil, right, which has such primacy. I mean, you talk about religion being deeper than ethics because ethics just deals with right and wrong, and religion deals with good and evil, right? At bedrock, okay? Good and evil do not have the same meaning in the East. Buddhism and Hinduism do something very different with good and evil.
I'm willing to accept your definitions of good and evil for the current argument.
The truth is, there's just not even evil is just ignorance on some level. It's just evil is just.
You haven't met any real evil people if you believe that.
Well, okay, so then all the Hindus and Buddhists are wrong about this. That's a possible claim. I'm just saying that there's over 1 billion people who have a religious system of stories from which they derive all kinds of meaning,
Yeah.
to which they're mightily attached, to where we could play the same game of archetypal interpretation and valuing, and yet the cash value with respect to good and evil is irreconcilable with what you get from Christianity.
Well, but it doesn't have to be interoperable, right?
Well, but the point. My
has to
point
be
is we
self-consistent.
live in a reality. Presumably, Hinduism is also useful as a set of heuristics
Has to be.
for Hindus. And if Hinduism, as a matter of doctrine, and as a matter of the interpretations of the heuristics by the devout in both systems, if Hinduism and Christianity are irreconcilable, right, then there must be a deeper level of reality that explains why they both work, that can't be reducible to Christianity being true or Hinduism being true. Right.
Yeah, look, Sam, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that objection. So this is one of the immense problems, obviously, that actually leads down the road to the kind of nihilism that you were objecting to in the moral landscape. It's like one of the things that Nietzsche said that's very much apropos to this, is that, it's one thing to have your belief system shattered by the observation that there are other belief systems that are incommensurate, that seem to have equal utility. But it's even worse is that once you make the observation that there are other belief systems that have equal utility, then it can shatter your belief in belief systems themselves. And then you're in the postmodern nihilist landscape, and that's a big problem.
Or you could just be in a more fundamental landscape that subsumes both of those belief systems.
That's fine. Let's hope that can happen.
Yeah.
But I would say that's the landscape that I'm trying to pursue. Now, you said that I've been approaching this, say, from a Christian perspective in this dialogue, and to some degree that's true, but there are reasons for that. But I would also say I'm also doing what you recommend doing. Because in Maps of Meaning, for example, because you said, well, what about this problem of multiple interpretations of the text?
You wrote Maps of Meaning.
What's that?
You wrote Maps of Meaning. I wrote the moral landscape.
I'm sorry. I must have missed. Sorry. I must have missed. I misspoke.
That
I'm
was
starting
confusing.
to get tired. But what I tried to do, I tried to address that problem seriously. Like, it's a really big problem. It's the problem of multiple interpretations. It's the postmodern problem, is that there's an infinite number of potential interpretations. Okay, so so what do we do about that? And the answer is, it's something you allude to, in the moral landscape. And it's part of the basis of your argument why these things need to be grounded in facts. So, because that is part of the answer to the problem of an infinite number of interpretations. In Maps of Meaning, I tried to do what E.O. Wilson recommended, but this was before he wrote his book. I tried to use a consilience approach. So I looked at multiple religious systems. I looked at Christianity. I looked at evolutionary biology. I looked at philosophy. I looked at neuroscience. And I looked at the literature on emotion and motivation and the literature on play that was very nicely delineated by Piaget. And I tried to see where there was a pattern that repeated across all dimensions of evaluation, which is exactly what you do, for example, when you use your 5 senses to detect something real in the world. And that's what Wilson recommended, was a consilience approach. And so my proposition was, if it manifests itself here and here and here and here and here, 6 places, and it's always the same pattern, then the probability that that pattern exists independent of my delusional interpretation is radically decreased.
Yeah, my claim, however, is that many of these things don't repeat. In fact, they're flipped around completely based on different religious assumptions in different cultures. And again, I would just argue, we can table this for another discussion.
I was trying to dispense with those.
But I'm just saying something as fundamental as evil doesn't run through all these cultures and all these religious traditions.
Then how can you make the claim that everyone would agree with your description of what constitutes bad in the beginning of the moral landscape?
It would be, it's not evil in the sense that there's bad and good, there's better and worse. There's better and worse.
So can we Sam, there's either universal moral intuitions or there aren't.
Yes, no,
which is it?
Yes, no, but evil.
Are some moral intuitions universal?
Yes, no, I would think, listen, we are just human beings. right? We're human beings first before we're Hindu or Buddhist or Christian. I mean, we can all get indoctrinated into the religion of our parents. This is an artifice that's laid on top of something far deeper. That
Right.
should be obvious.
So,
right.
we're
trying to get down to what's deeper.
Okay, so there may be some moral universals.
Sure, I think.
Okay, Jordan.
But
Is
no,
it
but
possible
but
that there
this-
are some moral intuitions that are highly specific to particular traditions and wouldn't translate over to others?
Yes. It's highly probable because
Highly
there would be
probable.
environment-specific adaptations, like the environment-specific tool use of chimpanzees.
Right.
Right.
Or maybe it's not even the environment. Maybe it's the self-consistency of the belief pattern in question. So
Sure, I would put that in the broader environment. It might be a consequence of the particularities of that culture. There would be things that, look, think about it like languages. Like many, and this is kind of an answer to the problem that you laid out, which is a real problem. I'm not trying to deny the problem. If you look at, there's a lot of languages. Lots of languages. Look at how different they are. It's like, yeah, at some levels of analysis, they're fundamentally different. And at other levels of analysis, they're fundamentally the same, which is how we know that they're languages. And you could say, well, there's a very large number of stories. It's like, yes, there are. But the fact that there's enough commonality across the class of stories, the set of all possible stories, so that we can identify what constitutes a story. And I would say that there's enough commonality across the set of all possible good stories that we can say, well, here's a canonical good story, which is, by the way, what you do at the beginning of the moral landscape. Because you say, this is horrible, this is good. We should move from what's horrible to what's good. Say, yes, you've taken a fragment of the universal story and you've made it the axiom of your moral system, which is what you should do. But the claim that I think is not helpful, even though I understand it, is that that's purely a claim of unmediated fact. It's like, no, there is no unmediated fact.
There is, yes. Even facts aren't unmediated facts. I mean, you can't judge something to be factual without presupposing the validity of certain intuitions, like that causes precede events. Or causes precede their effects, and those intuitions could be wrong. I mean, we could live in a teleological universe where everything's getting pulled into the future by some kind of attractor, right? And our notion of causation is totally backwards. That remains to be discovered, and we would use other intuitions to make that discovery. But again, you do pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that there's no branch of science or mathematics or anything fundamental, logic, that can get away from that.
Right. Well, and that's another place.
But given that picture, that doesn't render all intuitions equally respectable.
Absolutely.
Right? Someone
agreed.
says, "Well, I happen to have an intuition that Joseph Smith saw those golden tablets, and they were, and Mormonism is true." That's not the sort of intuition we're talking about here. Your intuition doesn't grant you insight into history.
What we could say, and this would be an elaboration of Brett's point, is that moral intuitions of the sort that you're describing have different zones of relevance. So there's some things that would only work as an intuition in very delimited areas of time and space, let's say. There's a hierarchy of moral intuitions, and the more profound the intuition, the more it works as a universal truth across context, just like in a scientific truth. So scientific truth is more profound. This is why the postmodernist readings of Thomas Kuhn are wrong, is that the idea that protons are real is really fundamental, because no matter what span of time and space that you pick, you're going to encounter protons. It works everywhere. And then with moral intuitions, let's say, or moral a prioris, you have the same issue, is some of them are so delimited that they only work here and now. And those are sort of impulsive, low-level intuitions, a whim even. But some of them are really, really deep. The ones, for example, the one that orients you to make the claim that you made in the moral landscape, that the hellish story is bad and the heavenly story is good,
right.
I would say that's one of the deepest, most context-independent moral intuitions. Which is kind of the claim you make, except you claim that it's
and again,
a fact.
Back to my fundamental concern here in the difference, with respect to the difference with how we talk about these things, to call that thing God is fine. That's a God I have no problem with, right? But that's not how most people most of the time are using the word, and there's something misleading about that, and that worries me.
Yeah, well, if the claim, if the claim that you're making is that we're all deeply confused about the nature of divinity and ultimate reality, it's like, yes, clearly.
Well,
And
another thing we agree on.
I also don't disagree. I don't disagree. Look, I've never made the claim that what I'm talking about is like what other people are talking about. I mean, it is in some ways, but I've not made that claim, so I don't see why that's a justifiable criticism. It's like...
Well, no, it's a criticism with respect to the very likely effects of communicating in that way. Because I see the results of that communication. It's a little bit, I mean, this is going to sound more invidious than it is, but this is the kind of thing that I get into with Deepak Chopra.
Yeah.
Deepak and I agree about a lot.
I think it's more invidious than it sounds, actually.
Yeah. Well, you're not wearing rhinestone glasses. If you graduate to that, we'll have more of a problem. But Deepak clearly wants to let his audience believe that everything they're into is on some level justifiable by his reading of quantum spookiness, right?
Yeah.
So it's all, so you know, if you want to go out and just buy a lot of crystals and think they're going to heal you, it has something to do with the quantum nature of reality.
Absolutely nothing like me.
No, but I think Deepak could say, if I got his back to the wall, Deepak could honestly say, listen, I've never said anything about crystals, right? I'm not selling crystals. I've never said they work, but it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation. The fact that it takes you 20 minutes to admit that a lot of the Bible is filled with barbaric nonsense.
I don't think it took me 20 minutes to admit that.
Well, we'll go to the tape on that.
These things matter. These things matter. And
I'm just saying, it's like you own
look,
it.
If you're saying that there's a danger...
If you're in a parish of 1, or in a parish of 1,000, or a parish of 100,000, but not in the parish that has anything in common with the Bible thumpers in my country who think that Jesus is very likely coming back in their lifetime because he never died, and he's going to judge the living and the dead, and there will be a resurrection and hellfire and all the rest. If that's not the game you're playing at all, own it.
Why are you all applauding about that? It's like, what do you mean own it? It's like, I already made my claim. It's like, I'm not playing a religious fundamentalist game. So what's all the applause about? So I don't understand that. And own it, it's like, I was as clear as I possibly could be when I delineated my answer to the question. People say, well, what do you mean by God?
Someone once asked you if Jesus was resurrected.
You want a 1-second answer?
But no.
Well, forget it, man.
Jordan, wait a minute, hold on.
I think we can actually...
This is a complicated
One
problem.
second. No, I mean, I don't want to end on a note of acrimony. But someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said it would take me 40 hours to answer that question. Okay, that's the kind of thing I'm responding to here. You don't need to do that if you have a clear-cut answer to that question. And
I don't have a clear-cut answer to that question.
And if you don't, that connects with many other things that we still have to talk about.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, because that...
It isn't obvious in the biblical account that Christ was literally resurrected. So it's not simple. This is not simple.
No, but if the question is, do you think let's put it probabilistically. I mean, anything's possible. I'll tell you that it's possible that he was physically resurrected. I mean, it's even possible.
But wait a second, I didn't
with respect
say
to quantum
that he
mechanics.
Was.
The point is,
I said it would take me 40 hours to answer the question. I didn't say that he was.
Well, go ahead. How's this for an answer? Almost certainly not. What's wrong with that answer?
You want? I think I know what's wrong with that answer.
It's a fine answer, and people have been giving that answer for a very long period of time, but the idea doesn't seem to go away.
Okay, but that's evidence of what exactly?
I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I can tell you one thing it's an evidence of.
All
There's
right.
a deep idea.
Then
There's a
let
deep
this be the doorway to our next 3-hour conversation.
Sure,
Because clearly we're not,
sure,
So
sure.
we have 10 minutes left.
Okay. Oh, well then, let's answer that question in 10 minutes.
So wait, I want you to trust me here. You for whatever reason decided I should moderate, so I want you to trust me. For one thing,
You have been
Listen,
doing yeoman's work.
Sam, I really would like to answer that question. But I'm trying to figure out. People seem to think that I'm trying to evade the question. It's like, I'm not evading the question. I'm trying to figure it out. People have been arguing about this for 2,000 years. It's like, it's not simple.
But that's a symptom of the effect of religious dogmatism for 2,000 years.
No, it's not.
okay,
It's partly a symptom of that. It's also partly a symptom of the idea.
The resurrection of Jesus is clearly an important question, but you've raised a much bigger and more pressing question for the audience, which is whether or not God cares whether they masturbate. So I actually think if we pursue that answer, that we will actually wrap this up in a way that...
You
yes.
want to end this on masturbation?
I think we owe it to them, too.
Okay.
So, give me a little leash.
The floor is yours.
Okay, great. How did I end up here? All right. So here's the question. Let's just figure out if we can determine why God might care if you masturbate, right? So let's suppose that we have a story, a heuristic of some kind that stands in for something. And the story is God is watching. He sees you always. He doesn't want you masturbating, so don't you dare. What happens?
What happens?
Yeah.
Well, it's a rather ineffectual
You sure?
idea. Yeah. Well, I mean,
You don't think that story prevented lots of people from masturbating?
Well, no, but I think the reality was that you had people masturbating and feeling terrible about it, and you had a whole layer of sexual neurosis that got grafted onto human psychology unnecessarily.
Okay,
I mean,
so-
Christianity has a certain typology of sexual hang-uppery, which the tantrics don't have.
So if I understand you correctly, you are agreeing that a certain number of people will have masturbated.
Some of them joined the priesthood and raped little boys. I mean, that's all
let's
of a
not
piece.
go there. Let's stick with the topic. So a certain number of people will have masturbated. They will have thought...
Honestly, it's the same topic. I mean, the taboos around masturbation, the taboos around sexuality prior to marriage, the taboo around divorce, all of the taboo around out-of-wedlock birth, the ideal of celibacy in the priesthood, all of that is just a diabolical machine of needless sexual conflict and misery.
Hold on.
But yes, okay.
You have to take diabolical out of there.
How's the whole flood of pornography thing working out for you?
I will grant you that there is some interpretation that takes supernatural principles and magic and otherworldliness out of the equation here that gets you some wisdom in the heuristic. Yes, if you're masturbating all the time, you're not satisfying your monogamous relationship with your wife or husband.
We don't even need to go there.
You're not procreating, and
let's
want
just
children.
agree that a certain amount of masturbation was prevented by that story, which made people fear the consequence of them engaging in it, which would result in, I'm pretty sure, less masturbation, which means that in seeking a release, which we are physiologically programmed to seek, one might end up looking in a more urgent fashion for a mate.
Right. So
right?
It's are we going to enforce monogamy? Is that
no. So look, I'm trying to take you somewhere. I think there is a way that we can rescue some important part of what both of you are saying that can now be reconciled, and then there's a bitter pill for each of you. I mean, that's just the way this looks to me. So if we can agree that this makes sense actually as a fitness-enhancing adaptation, that this story would result in people behaving in a way that might result in them marrying early, might result in them reproducing earlier than they would otherwise, right? Then we can understand it as mechanistic, and we can understand what you said, that, maybe God would care about whether or not people masturbate because God is a metaphor for some set of stories that gets you to behave in an adaptive fashion. But the point for you then would be that Sam is arguing, with reason, we can decide whether or not to employ this story at this moment, whether it's a good idea for us to urgently reproduce as quickly as possible, which, for example, increases the size of the population of the planet, whereas delaying reproduction keeps the rate of population growth down, and might be a better choice for a moment in history when we have 7.5 billion people on the planet. So, in some sense, what I think I see is the religious story itself makes some kind of sense if you adhere to it in a manner that you are obligated and have no tools with which to question it. Then you will miss the fact that at this moment you might want to throw that story out.
But the problem is it doesn't make, and this is a problem with these heuristics in general, it doesn't make sense for the right reason, and that's why it's not a reliable guide given other changes in the world. But with everything changing, you want to be making sense for the right reason. You don't want it, so useful fictions have to be retired at a certain point. Useful truths stay true. I mean, because they're based on your engagement with reality. And so to take your point about pornography, which I think is totally valid, you could have a completely rational conversation in terms of human psychology and sociology and what you want society to look like about the corrosive nature of pornography, right? That's not, you don't have to be a Victorian prude to worry that there might be something wrong with the infinite availability of pornography to 13-year-olds and above, right? I mean, that's I don't know what generation of human beings we're raising in the current environment. It's quite worrisome, actually. But again, you don't have to invoke mythology to do that. And I would say the temptation to invoke mythology, to say, well, you actually,
So how do you do it?
Poseidon really gets pissed off when you masturbate.
How do you do it? How do you do it?
We
don't have a mechanism. We have no mechanism for controlling that.
Talk about the effects on human relationships and your own mind and your own intention and the way you view other people.
Sam, that barely works for sex ed. It barely works for condom education.
What was that?
It barely works. Like those sorts of educational interventions to stop that kind of fundamental behavior have very little effect. Well, people aren't nearly as amenable to behavioral changes as a consequence of rational educational interventions as you might hope. I mean, and that's part and parcel of very broad clinical literature.
They're not as amenable to dogmatic intrusions either. I mean,
they are, and that might be a problem. And there are problems with that.
Well, no, because they're, again, this is just
like the terror of God in that situation.
All going in. The problem is that even if you could make the case that a dogmatic attachment to one or another religion was better, all things considered, than being secular, truly secular and truly rational, right? It's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to every next thing we find out. I mean, that's why it's like you could have said, if you go back, 200 years before the germ theory of disease, you could have said, well, all of these dietary taboos and taboos around, hand washing and foot washing, it's actually very wise. The wisdom of the germ theory of disease was sort of built into our scripture, and people were there was a kind of differential level of survival based on those who really adhered to these practices and those who didn't. Okay, but it's blind to the actual variables. Like there's nothing special about shellfish necessarily, or there's nothing special about pork necessarily, or whatever the example is. And once you get the actual variables in hand, then the whole edifice comes crashing down, and then you really just want to understand the variables that work.
Look, I don't know if the whole edifice comes crashing down, and it isn't clear to me that you want to claim that, because one of the things you did say in the moral landscape, and I think this is associated with your interest in spirituality, is that there is some baby mixed in with the bathwater. And the question is, how do we distill that out?
Yeah.
And the objections that you're raising are the objections that are, look how difficult it is to do the distillation. It's like, yeah, absolutely, man. And it's not like I'm a foe of the Enlightenment. I think you Enlightenment types, and I put Pinker in the same camp, radically overestimate the degree to that was a casus sui. It's like everyone was barbaric and superstitious until 1750, and some miracle occurred, and now we all became enlightened. Like there was a lengthy developmental history
clearly
of
we
that.
all haven't. I mean, this is hence our complaining about the problem. And most of the world most of the world hasn't had the Enlightenment yet.
True.
On some level.
Look, I'm no foe to the Enlightenment, but I think that it had a lengthy developmental history that is radically underplayed by the people who ground it purely in rationality.
It's clearly still developing. My point is, we should be able to agree that having a worldview guided by a continuous, honest engagement with reality insofar as we can apprehend it is better than having a worldview solidified or anchored to unchanging ideas that were born of people who had none of our present tools, none of our present insights into anything.
Well, it depends on the principles. It depends on the principles. Like I would say, there are situations where that clearly applies, but I think there are broad principles. And again, we should probably stop with this, I think.
Yep, we're about there.
Because I'm starting to get tired. I'm sure everyone else in here is starting to get tired. Well, I'm starting to get tired anyways. And I mean, there are principles, there are higher order principles of the sort that I described that you also appear to rely on in the moral landscape, the idea of these profound moral intuitions.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm after, is what are these profound moral intuitions and what is their source? And like, I'm also perfectly willing to make the claim, and have in fact in detail, that these moral intuitions, see, this is a place where we differ a little bit. It's like, and maybe we can go here tomorrow night. See, it seems to me that your argument is the facts are laying out there and you can extract out value from them, and we already described why you want to do that, because you want to at least not move into the nihilistic direction, and you want to ground them in some sort of reality. It's like, fair enough. But the thing is that the facts as they are have been around for a very, 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 very long time, right? Let's say 3.5 billion years, the entire expanse of life. And it's the operation of those facts on life that has produced the a priori implicit interpretive structures that guide our interaction with the facts. And those a priori implicit structures that have emerged out of this evolutionary course have a structure that mediates between us and the facts that cannot be derived from the facts at hand. And so then the question is, what is that structure? And it's in both of our interests to get that right, because you use that as the source of moral intuition. It's like, right, agreed, that's the source of moral intuition. So,
well, clearly we need to table this for tomorrow night, but that's a good...
guys, I'm just going to interrupt you. You guys, let's give Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and Brett Weinstein a huge hand. Let's go.
Thank you.